So, hello everybody. My name is Horacio. I am an Spaniard. I have been living in France for some 20 years. So yes, my accent combines the worst trait of Spanish and French accent. And you are going to suffer that for half an hour. I'm really sorry. I am a software developer in a startup, Citizen Data. We work on an open source time series database. I am the tech leader of the front-end part, and I am also rather implicated in local communities, local conference, and 2 years ago, Google appointed me as Google Developer Expert. So, I am here because I had a problem. I have been working with web components for several years, and since my first real application, I found a problem, and I tried to solve it in different ways. And then now when I speak about web components around me, there are a lot of people with the same kind of problem. So I am going to try to explain my solution and why I think it's a good solution. The problem is easy. You have a new application, you are using web components, and then you need to add a feature, a rather specific feature. For example, you need to generate a QR code, you need to do some data visualization, and you go to the different web component catalog, webcomponents.org or any other, and you find no web component doing what you need. But there are always some JavaScript library to do it. There are JavaScript libraries to do everything. So what can you do? Well, my point is that it isn't a real problem. It isn't a showstopper. It doesn't prove that the web component doesn't work. You will need to take your library, the library you have found, and wrap it in a web component. And then you will be able to use at any other web component. My point, what I am trying to show you, it is simple that it sounds. You don't need to write any complex code in order to componentalize a JavaScript library. So let's begin with some context. Let's begin with the history of how I did find this problem and why I did begin to work in this kind of solution. So let's go back some years ago. In 2013, I began to work at Citizen Data, and as front-end leader, my first task was to build an IDE to allow our users to deal with our time series database. So at the time, I was a real AngularJS fanboy. I had been doing Git for several years, and after Git, if you have done Git, you understand me, after Git, Angular was like a sunshine in a cloudy day. It was wonderful. So I did my IDE with a lot of directives, and it was nice, it worked. Several times later, my boss asked me, yeah, now we need a dashboard for monitoring, some data visualization, some of the same features that the IDE, but some new features. Okay, no problem. I took some of my directives. I created a new app. I created some new directives, and everything worked. I was happy. But happiness doesn't last. Several times later, my boss came again. So now there is a customer who wants to use your dashboard in his application. Nice, I can give them the source. Not, you haven't understood. He doesn't use AngularJS, he uses another technology. And then, I need to rewrite all my monitoring dashboard in another technology. It took several weeks. I wasn't really proud because it was quick, dirty, but it worked. So I told myself, okay, it was a bad moment, but not. Several weeks later, he comes again. Hey, we need another version yet, but this time it's for a customer that only use plain old HTML pages in a proprietary CMS but you need to recode it again. And that time, I knew that I needed a solution. Well, it was 2013, so I had looked at Google I/O presentation about Polymer. It sounded exactly like what I needed. Hey, you have some website modules, you can combine them, you can use them in any technology, any framework. It's wonderful. Oh, it's a bit alpha, but it's wonderful. So it sounded too good to be true, but I told myself, the next application, I will do it with web component. It wasn't easy. The technology was young, not very well supported. There were polyfills everywhere, and many Google guys like Alexi, you can see him at the Google booth over there, told me, you are crazy, it's an alpha, it's not production ready, don't do it. But when you are in need, you cannot afford to be picky. So I did it. And I did it, and it worked. I had a deadline. It was for our company both CES at Las Vegas in 2014. I had 2 months to do it, and it works. The whole story, you can read it there. But that's not the point of this talk. The point is that while I code that application, I found a big problem. I needed to do data visualization, I needed to do heat maps, a lot of data manipulation, and there wasn't any component to do that in the official Google catalog for Polymer, in Mozilla catalog of web component. No one has done it with web component yet. So I told myself, what can I do? I had 3 solutions. The first one, I could simply wait for somebody else to do it, but I had a deadline. The second one, I could try to use directly the libraries, D3.js and VD3, directly in one of my components and do some hacking way to make it work. A bit like people who use jQuery inside an AngularJS application. It is hacky, it's difficult to maintain, but it works. Or I could simply do the right things in my mind. I could write a clean implementation of a component, wrapping D3.js and wrapping MVD3. So I tried to do it. The first time it was difficult, but it worked. And I am going to explain you how I did. Because there wasn't only a thing I needed for this application. Since then, I have done all the front-end apps of my company in Polymer. And I have found the problem a lot of times. Hey, I need a new rich text editor for your IDE. Okay, let's use Ace.js. No implementation in components, but let's do it. I need a QR code generator. It's nice. There is no QR code generator in the web component catalog. Oh, let's do it. Every time I begin to develop a process, the same process for all the library, and I realized that yes, for some libraries you need to do a bit more code, you need to enter inside the library to see why it doesn't work as it should, but in general it's an easy and systematic process. If you do it, you finish rather quickly by having a component that you can utilize, you can use then in any of your application. So let's begin with an example. The example was a QR code generator. I needed, for a sign functionality, I needed a QR code generator, a rather flexible one. It should generate QR code from numbers, from alphanumeric text, from URL, and I needed it to be configurable. I needed to generate variable size QR code with variable number of elements. I needed it to generate both HTML and PNG format. So I needed something I could pilot finally in my application. and I needed to be sampled because it was a side feature. I didn't want to spend 1 month coding it. So I began by looking around the JavaScript libraries, and I chose QRJS. It's a very old library from 2011. It's really stable, and it was very, very well suited to my application. It's small, it's quick. For a side feature, it's important. It's rather well coded. Why is that important? Because sometimes you will need to go inside the library, fork it, do some modification. So if you take a library that is easy to understand, you are making your life easier. And a side effect that I didn't know at the moment, it doesn't manipulate directly the DOM. And why is that important? Because with web components, you are working with the shadow DOM. So most libraries that manipulate directly the DOM tree suppose that every element of the DOM tree is a grandchild of the document. So they can do document query element by ID, and it doesn't work in a shadow DOM world. So this one seemed good, it was good. And then I began with my steps, always the same steps. I begin by creating the element, then I add the library as a dependency, when working with Polymer using Bower, with other technology using NPM or anything other. And then in the element file, I load the dependency. There is a small subtlety there, I will speak about it. And then you simply build a web component that will wire the library to the outside world, and that will do it in a web component way, using the attributes as an input and the events as an output. So the first step, the first problematic step is how do you load the library? If you are using legacy libraries, they are almost always libraries that write things in the global scope, libraries that aren't modularized. So in order to use it in your component, you need to load the library once and only once, even if you have multiple elements in the application that use your library, and you need it to be loaded before your web component is initialized. Well, for my first elements, I did it in a quick and dirty way. I simply used the script tag in the element file, and as the element were loaded with HTML imports, I knew that it would only load once, so I supposed that everything was going to work, and it worked. It worked while I used it in full Polymer application. But once I had the problem with an Angular application that loaded the same dependency in another way, and I had the dependency loaded twice. So it was a hacky way. Then I decided to do it in a more computer science way. In my element, before loading it, I looked if the library was loaded or if it was loading. Then I load the library, and when it was ready, I initialized the element. It was nice, but it was a lot of code. I didn't want to do it every time I create a new element with a dependency. So I did the only thing that makes sense. I componentalized the dependency grabbing. I create a small behavior for Polymer 1 or mixing for Polymer 2 or vanilla web component, something that all my elements will inherit that will manage all the dependency grabbing process. So in that mixing, I take my dependencies, I see if they are loaded, if they are loading, I load them in the right order if there are several, and then at the end, I send an event to my element to say, hey, you can go on, all your dependencies are there. So we can go to the real problem. I have a library, it's load. How can I take that library and offer to the outside world a web component interface? Well, there I almost always use the same guide. I began by defining the inputs, the attributes I need in order to pilot my library. Then I define the outputs, the events that my library that my element is going to send to the outside world. I define what I need in the UI side, a template, and then I wire everything in order to link the attributes to the way how the library expects the information to arrive. And then you can simply initialize things if you need it and use your element. Don't try to read the code. It's for the QR code generator. The only interesting thing is that it's a very flexible library. There is a data attribute, the data you want to encode. And there are a lot of other attributes, but for most of them, I simply defined a default value. So they become optional attributes. You don't need to use them in most applications unless you need to do something different. For example, if I needed to do bigger or smaller QR code, or if I wanted to generate an image file instead of HTML blocks. So, and I also added another element, an auto. I will explain later why. The output, my component is a simple one. It's only need to push an event when a QR code has been generated. The template, well, then you need to know your library. My QR code library was very simple. It wants you to give it a DOM node, and it will create all the QR code inside that DOM node. So, in my shadow DOM, I create a div element, and in the initialization, I am going to tell my library, hey, you put your image or your HTML-generated QR code inside it. And then we do the wiring. For the wiring, the first thing I do is making some validation. For each attribute, I do in sanitization a validation in order to discard values that make no sense. For example, a negative size for the block. Why I do it? Because most libraries, if they are well written, they are already doing it in the inside. Because then my element, when it receives a wrong attribute, is going to send an event or to replace it by the right attribute. So for debugging, you don't need to debug inside the application. You can debug component by component. It's way easier when you are doing an application with a lot of components, saying directly the errors at the component level. Then I had a listener to know if the input parameters have changed, because I wanted a flexible mode. I wanted, if an attribute auto was on, I wanted it to generate a new QR code on the fly every time a parameter changed. And if I put it as false, I wanted it to don't generate a new QR code and only generate it manually when I call the method to generate it. So, and then I wire everything to the library. My library expects to have an options object. You call the library with an options object and a DOM node, and it will generate the QR code there. So I do a sample mapping. I create an options object using all the properties I have defined, and I call the method to generate the kind of QR code I want to generate. And then I listen the library to tell me when the component has been generated, and I can push my event to the outside. For the moment, it's only a rather mechanical mapping. Oh, I create an object, I call the method. The advantage is that for somebody using the element, he doesn't need to know anything about my library. She or he only needs to put the attributes and listen to the events. I can tomorrow change my library for another implementation and change my mapping. Everything will work. So it worked. I have a nice QR code generator. It was nice. And I told myself, hey, if every time it is so simple, it's going to be great. Sometimes it isn't so simple. Several months later, I needed to do an application for Devoxx US, a QR code scanner. It was quite a challenge. I was rather proud that Devoxx crew had told me to do it, to try to do it. I wanted to do a full progressive web app application to scan attendees badges. And it was for the sponsor, so it needed to work. So I told myself, well, I only need to scan a QR code. I have already generated QR code. It will be easy. Well, it wasn't so easy. There were lots and lots of QR code scanner JavaScript libraries. I tested a lot of them. Most of them didn't work as intended. Several of them didn't work at all. So I took the 3-4 that worked. I did the same kind of analysis that the last time. I wanted something small, something quick, something well-written. And I chose JS QR Code by Lasersoft. It's a good library. It's also an old library. It was small, it was quick, it was well coded, but I hadn't seen it did some dirty DOM manipulation, and it was going to come back after me sometime later. So I took my task sheet, so I need to do that. Well, I create my element, I use the dependency grabber to grab my dependencies, everything should work. Okay, I need to build the web component encapsulating it. For the input and output, it was even sample. I added some functionality like an active attribute in order to tell the library to shut down, because by default, the library, it scans every time. When you initialize it, it will scan even if you have no new video flow, it will scan every time. So the battery went down rather quickly. So I added an attribute for that. I added a property in order to get via properties the decoded value if I needed, the video size. Well, the only output was an event when I had decoded a code. The template, I told myself, hey, it's a very simple library. I only need a video, a canvas and a video tag in order to use WebRTC and get the video flow for your telephone or your computer, a canvas to take pic of that video, and the library is going to read the canvas and analyze looking for our QR code. Well, it was the theory, because I discovered then that all the browsers implemented WebRTC for years, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, but not all the browsers. Safari still didn't implement WebRTC. In fact, Safari will implement it in iOS 11 that will be released essentially soon, I think. But at the moment, when I wrote it, Safari didn't support WebRTC at all. So I had to do some hacky things in order to tell iPhone to open the native photo application, to take a pic and to capture the pic and put it in my canvas. So this is why it seems way more complicated than it should. Then I initialize my component. So I tested if my device supported WebRTC or not. If it supported WebRTC, I initialize WebRTC. If not, I initialize the call for the native picture application. And then, please don't try to read it. And then I began to tell myself, no, it isn't so easy, because WebRTC it's well supported, but it's rather different in each different browser. So I had to test if I was in Chrome, in Firefox, or in Edge, and doing the right initialization for each browser. And I had to test if I had a multi-camera or not, and doing the right initialization, but it wasn't very difficult. It was mechanic. So I was happy, almost no worrying, it should work. No, it didn't work. And I spent several times trying to understand why it works outside my component, but when I put it in a component, nothing worked. And it is then that the dirty DOM manipulation bite me. I dig in the library, I went down, and I saw a line, maybe you can see it, document.getElement by ID QR canvas. In fact, it's supposed that your tag, your canvas tag, it's going to be called QR canvas, and it is a grandchild of document. So it couldn't work in a Shadow DOM world. But then I did a fork. I tried to keep exactly the same functionality. I didn't want to break anybody's code, but I added a parameter in order to give it manually a DOM element. If I don't give a DOM element, it's going to do the by default behavior, but when I give then a DOM element, it's going to use it, and then I could pass to my library the DOM element. So the Shadow DOM problem, it wasn't a problem anymore. I have found that in many libraries, it's really important to understand how your library works with the DOM, and try to choose libraries that work with DOM elements and not with IDs or with fixed IDs. And then it worked. It was used by the sponsor, and it was a rather innovative way to test progressive web apps. There are some other examples, and always the same idea. You are going to wrap, in this case, ACE.js, a rich text editor, in a web component way with attributes and events. So I have 1 minute left. I have done it with lots and lots of libraries. I haven't found any library that I couldn't, with a small fork sometimes, adapt to this approach. And it has never taken more than 1 or 2 days to put your library in a component way. And then you can use it everywhere, and you can decorrelate it from the library in networking. You can use it as a normal web component. So yes, it will be better to have web components for everything, but if you are working with web components and you don't have the component you need, don't be afraid. Look for a library, choose the right library, and 1 or 2 days later, you will have your component. So I think time is up. Thank you very, very much.